I'm here with Ken Kahneman, Vice President of Supply Chain at TBM Consulting, to talk about how manufacturing companies can drive performance in what feels like another challenging time. Ken, with inflation at an all time high, interest rates rising, and this ongoing labor pinch, what can companies do in the short term, like the next 6 months, to mitigate the rising costs they're seeing in their supply chains? So, just talk specifically about supply chain for us.
Well, I think from a supply chain perspective, right, what's you're seeing going on and companies who are in front of this, they are looking for a couple of things. One is an alternative source because it's closer to where they're at. They're looking at alternative materials, and those materials are could be at a lower price point. They're getting exceptions from their customers to use an alternative material that can be at a lower cost. And then you're also seeing companies go after things that are typically around coming out of your operation, which is around yield, right? And so really focusing on where is the material being lost and how they're dealing with that, right? The logistics side of the house, transportation costs continue to go up. They're continue to be a challenge. I think the key becomes is how do you look at things where I'm not having to transport them as long as distances, and you're going to end up balancing the trade-off between, I'll call it the unit purchase price and your total landed cost to get your
Okay.
products to your locations.
Are you, out of curiosity, with inflation running 8, 9%, whatever it is, are you seeing variability in that? Meaning, like maybe materials costs are rising faster than shipping costs, or vice versa. Like, are you seeing sort of like variability there, or is it dependent on every company and every situation?
It depends on which area of the supply chain you look at. It depends on where geographical area you're talking about
Hmm.
from the globe. And it's also tied to what commodities, right? So, if you look at things that are coming out of Asia, shipping costs have gone way up. If you look at trucking costs have gone way up, right? I've had clients telling me that, a container that used to cost them $4,000 or $5,000 is now costing them $20,000.
Oh my gosh,
You
it's like
combine that then
300%
with
inflation.
exactly. So
Yeah.
it's it's all due to the constraints that are going on right now in that portion of the supply chain. From a materials cost perspective, yes, some customers are passing through cost increases and they're not having any challenges. And then you're seeing, quite frankly, with other large core metals, commodities, steel, aluminum, lithium, right? There's just such a high demand that the pricing elasticity on that is huge. Whereas in other things, it's not as big. So it's really variable depending on where you're sourcing, what it is you're sourcing, and how much of it you're buying.
And inflation is all over the place. We report a single number, but for manufacturing companies, it's a massively variable, wide range, depending on exactly what you just said: geography, materials, what you're making, all kinds of things. So,
So, Jason, if you look at it from this perspective, right? Typically, in most organizations, unless you're a distribution operation, but even then, cost of goods sold is the biggest nut in the cost equation.
mhm.
Typically, that number is for materials, right? If you just looked at materials alone, is probably 50 to 60% of that cost of goods sold. So while you do have inflation on labor, that's on a much smaller bucket and portion of your total cost. Supply chain is where you have a big portion of the impact of inflation around materials and how you get those materials. And companies need to keep their sights on that because it used to be inventory was cheap, right? That's what we always hear. I don't have to worry about inventory because money's cheap. Well, money's not cheap anymore.
Are you seeing, as a result of that, are you seeing more companies trying to reduce inventory, trying to just, accelerate inventory turns more than they did maybe 6 months ago, 12 months ago?
Well, I think they're focused on trying to get their inventories to the right levels, right? Because as they went through the last several years with all the disruptions that have been occurring, they did exactly what I thought in many cases they would do, is they started to game the system. They started placing additional orders. They started placing double the size of their typical orders. And this is what you've seen happen in the retail world. In the retail environment, we all know that those guys are trying to get rid of inventory.
Yeah.
Why? Because they gamed the system. That's what your purchasing people do. If I can't get it and they keep getting pushed to get it, they start going, well, I'm going to place 2 times the orders than I normally do, 3 times the order. I'm going to double the quantity so at least I'll get something, right? And now, as it all starts to come through and we get it, now they've got this glut of inventory that they're now trying to figure out, how do I get rid of it?
It's a massive inventory hangover.
Yes, it is.
So let's talk longer term then. So assuming they work through this, right? And you're looking out 12, 18 months and you're still, however long inflation is sitting where it is and interest rates are higher than they've been. What should companies be doing, in that longer term?
Well, if I was to look at it from a couple of perspectives, right? One would be you need to be really thinking about where your suppliers are located
Mhm.
and how you deal with your suppliers, right? Those individuals who work closely with their suppliers and can better share forecast, more accurate forecast information, will be being a better customer will help you with your suppliers, quite frankly, right? That's one. The second is, you have to follow. I go back to my old automotive days in Toyota Gosei and the Toyota model. You always had 2 suppliers for parts in different commodities. Now, one would have more volume, but you knew that the other supplier had capacity and capabilities to actually deliver should the other supplier fall down, right? So you could quickly move molds, whatever it is you need, to that other supplier and change the mix between the 2 suppliers. The model was typically 80-20. One supplier had 80% of the business, the other one had 20. That was a fail safe for making sure that we had not have a disruption to supply at the automotive assembly plant, right? So you have that perspective. You then have the perspective of, it's not so much around supply chain, but it's more into your engineering teams, which is, what are alternative materials that we could use, right? And that's the way you need to look at these things. I think what we're finding is the disruptions continue, right? Um, we're seeing work stoppages at ports, truck drivers in California, right? We're seeing shutdowns still in Asia and China, and that obviously is impacting the supply chain. We're seeing rounds of COVID go around again, right? And I've had several clients where recently several key individuals in the facility in the business actually came down with COVID. So um, this is not going away, unfortunately. So I think we have to be more flexible in your supply chain designs. We have to be considering risk as a part of the equation, because if you don't consider the risk and we only think about lowest unit cost, that drives you to certain decisions. So while you may be able to get a better source at a cheaper product, the risk profile may be higher for a certain supplier that's in Asia versus maybe one that's here in the US versus one
Okay.
that's in Latin America, right? Or Central America or Mexico. The key becomes is we've learned that risk is lost revenue and lost profits that we went through in the pandemic. That's how you can quantify that risk.
On that, staying on that thread for a second, if you're a COO or an operations leader and you have a nearshoring program in process right now, is that something that they should be accelerating that plan? Should they shelve those plans, stay the course? Like, how would you be thinking about that if on your mind was, hey, we want to bring some of this production back closer to where we're selling?
I think they should accelerate it, quite frankly.
Okay.
Um, if if they're just getting started right now, you're behind. Your
Okay.
customers. and your competitors have been doing this, and it's been going on for probably the last 8 to 12 months pretty seriously, and you're falling behind very quickly.
What how has the current environment, be it inflation, rising interest rates, how has that maybe brought the need to accelerate that? Like, how has that maybe heightened the need?
Oh, well, I think it's just piled onto the top of the pandemic and what we've gone
Yeah.
through from all the supply chain disruptions, right? So you had the pandemic, then we had the ship that dropped 2,000 plus containers into the ocean, the Pacific Ocean, which is more. In one ship, they dropped more than what typically happens in a year, right?
Wow.
You had the Evergreen blocking up the Suez Canal. So
Hmm.
these things continue, right? And so inflation now and the rising cost, which were they were going up to start with because of all the disruptions, now they're just going up higher because of the inflation. So sitting back and going, okay, well, it's all inflation driven is not 100% true.
Yeah.
A lot of this is driven by all the disruptions that we've experiencing, and that we, quite frankly, I don't think we will continue to experience these going forward, because I think we've realized that we're not as invulnerable as we may think as the human species.
Yeah. Fair enough. All right. One last question before I lose you. So, let's talk production planning for a minute. So, where do companies fall short? You talked about being a good customer. So just talk to us about that a little bit. How do companies tend to fail in planning, and how does that, essentially create problems in their supply chain?
Well, actually, yes. So I would argue that it's more in their supply planning than production planning.
Okay.
Okay. And what I mean by that is there are planning parameters that you need to be able to support the business, right? And those planning parameters deal some with, I'll call it inbound from your customer demand, and what are their lead time expectations and service level expectations, right? And inventories you need to support that. But more importantly, are your planning parameters for your materials and your components and your parts, right? So, for example, I was just at a company the other day where their lead time from their European suppliers has gone from 4 weeks to 12 weeks, right? And we're hearing this similar discussion everywhere. And the problem is, if you go look at the ERP and the planning parameters that they're using, they're not adjusting their lead times. Okay, number one. Number two is you also have to factor in the reliability of the delivery and how on time is that product coming in from that supplier. Because if that supplier and that order and that shipment 50% of the time is delayed, guess what? You're
Yeah.
not going to have it. It seems complicated, but it's actually really simple. When you step back
Yeah.
and really go, okay, 50% of the time we don't get it, and it's not going to be here in time, and it's 2 weeks late. There's your coefficient of variation that you need to be thinking about and bringing into your planning parameters, so that you have some idea of when you really need to be ordering things to have it there when you need it to run the business.
Yeah. Well, Ken, this was super helpful and enlightening. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk through how companies can, navigate this sort of difficult time from a supply chain perspective.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jason.